Church. I am so glad music was awesome today because this sermon has given me much trouble. And you know what? I'm glad Leo is going to be speaking next week. And I'm glad that you guys hopefully don't have anything in your hands to throw at me. But this is like one of the most shocking statements that Jesus made. And we're not putting any scripture on the back wall. And I'll tell you why. Because I want to make sure that you know that this didn't come from, you know where it came from. You can look back at it, you can look at it again, because this thing is so shocking. There's a pew Bible in front of you, and if you don't have your Bibles, grab that, or if you want to go to BibleGateway.com, you can look up these passages that we're going to be looking at today. But we want to make sure you know where to go and be able to look this thing up, because I'll be honest, I'm very uncomfortable with this topic. For some of you today, you're going to feel for a moment like you're being condemned. You're going to feel like Jesus is picking on you. But this is my one request. Just stay to the end. Don't walk out, okay? Because we're going somewhere with this thing. So next week, just let me give you kind of a preview of a few things. Leo's got this really sweet teaching on communion, and we're going to have communion together, and he's going to be the teacher next week. And so you want to be here for that. And then the following week we're going to start this thing called Big Wolf. And this is inspired by my children. They're really scared of Big Wolf. And Jesus kind of talks about this idea of this wolf and him being a good shepherd. And but when he talks about that, he's talking about Satan, but he's also talking about these things that kind of capture us or grab us. And what we're going to be talking about for 4 weeks is money. And it's not like give us more money type of a sermon series. It's like the power of money, like how powerful it is, and a few other things that we'll be talking about. So you want to be here, and we're going to be looking at the big wolf and how it affects our lives. But today, we're kind of going to one of the most shocking statements that Jesus has ever made, and it's kind of this mirror on the wall. What's the most shocking statement of all? You're going to find out in just a second. This Sunday would be, for me, would be great if Jesus was coming and teaching. And, he would teach this thing, and next week you'd go, man, Jesus, he's so tough. He's so hard. And I'd be like, we shouldn't invite him back anymore. You'd be like, yeah, because that's just too difficult what he's talking about. And so it'd be on him. But remember, these are red letter in most Bibles, and so this is Jesus, not me talking. And so I want to just kind of, give you this picture. But what we'll be talking about today is marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And for about 500 years in the early church, this wasn't a problem. This wasn't something that they thought these verses were problematic. They're going to be problematic for us today in the culture we live in. And these were verses that women of the early church, man, they loved these verses because it provided protection, and it was just this really safe place for women. And it looked at marriage and said this is very permanent, and they saw this as very permanent. The early church did, that marriage would be a reflection of their relationship with God. Their relationship with their wife or their spouse was a reflection of their relationship with God. And it wasn't about being happy. It wasn't about this is fulfilling me type thing. This was a reflection of their relationship with God. And so you could no less be like, hey, God, I'm done with you, and walking away from your relationship with God after you've become a believer, then you could do that with your marriage. Nothing was going to separate you from God and your relationship, and nothing was going to separate you from your spouse. And so they understood this concept. They understood what it was like to live in this marital relationship, and they lived in a culture that was much like ours. They lived in a culture, the Roman culture was kind of high society type thing. They were wealthy, and the wealthy people of the Roman society, they came to a point where they kind of abandoned marriage, and where marriage was not kind of an en vogue type of thing that they would do. And they would have a slave, or they would have, and their slaves were a little bit different than how we maybe envision slaves, or they would have someone else, and they would have these relationships all over the place, and they were wealthy people, and then at the end of their life, they would just pick somebody to be their heir. They didn't have to have an heir. They didn't have to have this family structure. And think Hollywood, and you have Roman culture, really. And so the whole idea of marriage became something that was really not something that they wanted any part of. The church comes along, and the church, these people start getting married, and they're staying married. And this is like this really weird concept. And it was really inviting to a lot of people, and it captured the attention of the pagan world. And then the church became the state religion of Rome, and it kind of started to kind of fall apart at that point because Christianity was in vogue, it was a good thing, and then they started to go, well, how do we still get married and divorced? And they started to look for loopholes. And kind of like our culture, what does it mean for us to get divorced? What does it mean? How can I, get out of my marriage and still make God happy? And, those type of questions. And, how can I, break this covenant and not be really guilty? And so they started to ask those questions and kind of some of the same questions that we ask. And so we see the church starting to kind of miss this picture that God had created. And Jesus is going to answer some of these questions in these texts today. It's interesting to me as I talk to people and have talked to people who are contemplating divorce, how it usually goes is this. They will tell me, I'm struggling in my marriage, and this person does, or this person does it, or he does this, or she does this. And it's always about this other person. I know I have faults, but, they're this or they're that. And this is why we got married too young. We tried counseling, it didn't work. He promised this, she promised this. And these are like kind of things that people say. And it's almost like they're trying to justify why they're getting a divorce. And they're looking for, almost a defense against this choice to get a divorce. And you know what? This is purely speculation on my part, but I've talked to a number of people who have gone through that or have struggled through the reality of divorce in our culture. And what I think happens is the thing that Jesus is going to say, they kind of already know and already understand this, but there's this tape kind of playing in their head that's kind of saying, you know what, this is why this had to be. This is why this had to be. Because there's something that just doesn't totally dissolve in this divorce. And we're going to look at what Jesus says, and I think why that is. And again, stick with me. You're not going to feel, hopefully, at the end that you're condemned, because I don't think Jesus wants you to feel that, and I know I don't. But there is some realities that he talks about this, and he talks about marriage in a way that is really difficult. So if you have your Bibles, turn in them, and we're going to be looking in Matthew. And we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 5. And I think I actually have some numbers here. I thought I wrote them down. Yeah, 959 if you have the Pew Bible. 959. Page 959. And this is the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm going to start with a little different passage. And this is the end of the teaching. Jesus teaches on this. And his disciples say this: if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it is better not to marry. It is better not to marry. And this is how bad this thing is. And so this is how crazy that Jesus is, what he's talking about here. And so we're going to pick up, though, in a little bit different place than where that passage came out of. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 5 to start off. And this is the Sermon on the Mount. And these are all extreme statements. Remember, Jesus, if somebody says, I love the Sermon on the Mount. No, you don't, because you don't understand it then. Because what he says in this thing is like cut your arm off, pluck out your eye, just these kind of crazy, crazy thoughts. And he goes through this whole thing of what he's actually telling us. The reason he does that is to try to help us to understand this kingdom perspective, to understand how God views the world, how he sees the world, and how reality really is. And so it's this whole thing of us praying for God's will to be done here on earth. It's culminated in the Sermon on the Mount. He tells us these are the realities of this world. This is how it actually is supposed to be. And it's really difficult, and they're really hard to understand sometimes. But we're going to pick up just a little bit earlier before Jesus starts talking about divorce. And so if you can imagine, Jesus is teaching, and they're hearing this for the very first time. He says, you have heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body to go into hell. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to become an adulteress. And anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord. Okay, so you're cutting your arm off, you probably committed adultery, and this thing is going really fast. This is the first time you've ever heard this. It's not in writing in front of you, and you're going, what? I'm going to hell? I've got to cut things off or pluck things out. And if I'm a student at this time, I'm going, slow down, Jesus. What are you talking about? Like, let's take a few steps back here, and let's, explain this, what you're saying. And I think that the disciples, as they're hearing this, or the people are hearing this, they're struggling through what this actually means. For the first time, they're hearing these really extreme statements. And there's this extreme statement about divorce or marriage and divorce. And let's look at it again, because I think I had questions as I first read it, and I still have probably questions about it. It says in verse 31, it has been said, and this means there's a common thought in the time period. Anyone who divorces his wife, so male, we know it's a male-dominated culture. Women aren't really allowed to divorce their husbands, must give her a certificate of divorce. And everyone in the crowd at that time, if you were in the crowd, you would be going, oh, you know what, I hear that, I get that, I understand that, because we've heard this before. This makes sense to us. And the reason that they were giving these certificates for divorce, to give you a little historical background, is that during the time of Moses, they were getting divorces, and he said, you have to give them this piece of paper to say that they're divorced from you. Because if a woman was to go to your house and you were to invite her in, and she did not have a piece of paper, you were kind of inviting in a harlot into your home, because she had left her husband, or she was a bad wife. And so Moses was actually protecting the women by saying, hey, you have to present her with this piece of paper. And you couldn't go to even your family's house. Your brother, if you were kicked out of your house, if your husband said, you know what, we're getting a divorce, you couldn't even go back to your family members, because it was that big of a deal. And so what Moses was doing was trying to help them to be able to not have to be really bag ladies or to be beggars. And so he said, you have to give this certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, this is verse 32, except for sexual immorality. Notice he doesn't say adultery. And I think in this text, I'm reading from a little bit different one, it says marital unfaithfulness. And the actual word there is porneia, which we get some words in our English language from, but it doesn't necessarily mean adultery. It does mean that, it includes that, but it means, like we can think in a lewd or in a sexual type of a manner, but it doesn't necessarily mean that she's committed adultery in that culture or in ours. So what Jesus is saying there. It's to kind of give you some examples, it would be like if you thought that your spouse was doing something evil or bad, that would have been permittable for divorce, if it was able to be proved. And that's what Jesus is saying here. So the word is porneia, it's not, and that's important. So just kind of keep that in the background, and we'll get back to that. The next verse, it says in verse 32, it says, but I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness causes her to become an adulteress. And anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery. What? Is that confusing to anyone? How is she the one? You're the one who's giving her a divorce. How is she the one who is committing adultery? This is very, very confusing. And when I read this, I went like, that doesn't make sense. She's divorced now. So how is this guy or this person, how is that person who marries the divorced woman committing adultery? Does Jesus not understand adultery? Does he not understand what that word means? What is he talking about here? And I think that there's this sense where we kind of go, this doesn't really make sense. And, you don't really understand. She's not married anymore. And so why can't she be remarried? Why can't I marry her? How am I committing adultery? This is very confusing. And I think what Jesus would tell us is, by your very question, you may not totally understand what happens in marriage. You might not understand totally what happens in this covenant of marriage. And so what happens in this is Jesus teaches this, and the Pharisees, man, they love to hang out with Jesus, right? And they like to walk around, and they like to follow him, and they looked for things when he was teaching that were outside of what Moses taught. And the reason that they did this is because they wanted to disprove Jesus, right? They wanted to make him, if they could tell the people, hey, Moses said this, Jesus said this, and they're different, then Jesus is not from God. He's not a prophet from God, right? That's what they're trying to disprove. And so they hear this teaching at a certain amount of time. And they're cruising around, and they're in their little think tank, and they say, wait a second, we have something here. Turn your Bibles to chapter 19 of Matthew, and so we're going to take a look at what the Pharisees, and we're starting at verse 3. They want to make sure when you're confronting somebody, or they're confronting Jesus, and they think they've trapped Jesus, what they always want to do is they want to make sure that there's a crowd around, because they want other people to witness this, right? And so they make sure that there's a crowd around, and in verse 3, it says, some of the Pharisees came to him to test him. They weren't really inquiring an answer. They're trying to trap Jesus to try to help themselves to prove that he is not a prophet of God. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Jesus, tell us, what are the parameters between God and society that make it okay? What are the circumstances that a man can divorce a wife? And there's two dominant thoughts at this time, and this is kind of what they're asking. They're asking him to describe what side he falls on. And this is one, and this is there's ancient texts that tell us this stuff. That one view was that if you were going to divorce your wife, you could divorce her for any and every reason, including if she burned last night's meal. Is that crazy? You burned last meal? Here's your certificate of divorce. Get out. One text actually says that if you find somebody more attractive, you can divorce your wife. And it's permissible. Isn't that crazy? So that was one view, and that was a dominant view of that time. And then there was another one that said that if you found her unfaithful, and if you found her unfaithful during, not the marriage, but during the engagement period, and that you could divorce this person. And we kind of go, and we got to go back to this whole thing of how can we commit adultery, all that whole thing, if you're not married. Well, in their culture, remember that there is this engagement period. And at that point, it was a legal, binding contract between the parents and the people who are going to get married, that they were, in essence, had to, if you were not going to marry that person, you had to give them paperwork. You had to say, I'm not going to marry this other person. We know this from the story of Joseph and Mary, right? He goes to her, and it says, it doesn't say divorce her in most texts. It says that he's going to put her away quietly, which I really like. Like, it's like a mafia thing in the Bible. Like, he's going to put her away quietly, right? That's what it most translates. Because we have no reference for this engagement thing, this engagement idea, and understanding that you have to give legal papers, or it is as a divorce. But the actual word is that word divorce. And so Mary and Joseph, he's divorcing her. And because he thinks that she has committed adultery. And in their culture, it didn't have to be, you didn't have to prove it, right? You didn't have to prove that they They did. They only had to appear. And this is where we get this idea of porneia. So let's say you were a male and you were walking down and you were engaged. You're 15 years old and you're going to get married next year and you're engaged to this. She's a fine looking thing just down the road, right? She's the neighbor kid and you've known her and you just, man, you really like her. And you're walking down the road with your dad and all of a sudden you look off to the side and out of the barn comes Jim Bob and your wife-to-be. And you're engaged to her. And, you know, Jim Bob's wiping off some hay. There's no proof that they did anything. But it appears that they may have. At that point, you were recognized that you could go and you could give a certificate of divorce. And you would do that. That's what Joseph was doing. He was putting her away quietly. He was doing the legal thing that he was supposed to, because it wasn't that you had to prove that she had an immoral act or committed adultery. In Joseph's case, there was some proof that, you know, she had a baby in her tummy. So there was something going on there. And God, remember, the angel comes to him and says, no, this is okay. You are to marry her still. And so this is what they're asking. So these are the two schools of thought here. One is that you can divorce for any reason. The other one is you can only divorce if there's adulterous type of a relationship. So Jesus, he replies, haven't you read? This is verse 4. He's talking to the most educated people in all of Jerusalem. Very sarcastic Jesus, kind of funny. He says, haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female? And you can almost see the Pharisees at this point going, okay, fascinating, Jesus. Yes, we have read that. Thank you very much. We know that God created man and woman. But what are the circumstances which a man can divorce a woman? And don't tell us one of those parables, because those are always confusing to us, right? You know, they're going, this is our question. And this is really important. So if you're like using your phone and you're actually texting her right now, stop for just a second and listen to this. Because like in our culture, it was the same in their culture. They were looking for some loophole or some term where it said it's okay society-wise and also God-wise. He did this or she did this. Or he would never, my wife did this to me. You know, whatever the justification. My wife promised. My wife threatened. My husband did this. That's what they're asking Jesus. What is the circumstance? And Jesus says, you're looking right here at this current situation that's right in front of you, and you're missing something. You don't understand what marriage is all about. And he says, in the beginning, God created a man and a woman. And it goes on, and he's quoting out of Genesis here. And he said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and will be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Two becomes one. Two becomes one. And then he goes on. So they are no longer two, but what? One. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. Two become one. How does that happen? I don't know. God joined them together. I don't know how it exactly happens. But he says it does. These two become one. And so God has joined them together. So the Pharisees are really asking, under what circumstances can one become two again? That's their question. That's their question. Under what circumstances can one become two? And what Jesus is saying is that there is more to a marriage than just a license and a honeymoon. Somehow these two become one. What do you say? Two become one. So it goes on. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore God has joined them together. Let no one separate. This sounds really permanent, doesn't it? Doesn't it sound permanent? Here's Jesus. He's saying, don't attempt to unone that which God has made one. That leaves us a little bit paralyzed, doesn't it? A little bit paralyzed in the sense that these circumstances of betrayal, abandonment, this person did this person did that. But the question is, to Jesus, how do you take scrambled eggs, something that God has joined together and made one in marriage, and how do you separate them again? Jesus changes kind of the question, doesn't he? He says, you're asking me a question, is divorce permissible? And I'm telling you that I don't even know if it's possible. I don't know if it's possible to become one. How do you separate them again? I think that's why he's telling them this. So, if you're kind of reeling from this a little bit, and we all know someone, or maybe we've experienced divorce and in our own lives, and you're going, man, this is tough, just continue to stick with me. And I think the Pharisees at this point, they're reeling a little bit too. And they're struggling through whether or not he understands the question. And Jesus is saying, maybe you recognize this divorce through this paperwork, through this certificate, but maybe your Father in heaven doesn't. So they go on. But why then, they ask, and here's the Moses thing, did Moses, and look at the word he uses there, command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? This goes back to the whole Moses thing. And here's the interesting thing about Moses wrote Genesis, right? So in the beginning, God created. In the whole passage that Jesus talks about, God made one flesh. This whole idea that they are joined together, that a man leaves his father and mother and they become one flesh. And that's in Genesis. And Moses wrote that, but he also commanded them. So the Pharisees are kind of going, hey man, we're out of this. Moses knew that passage, and he still, and they used the word, commanded us to give a certificate of divorce. And so they're going, okay, this is a little bit better. Now maybe we have Jesus trapped again. And verse 8, Jesus replies to them, and he says, Moses permitted, not commanded, he permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. So basically, he's saying to them, you know your history of your people. The people of Israel, you know the history of the people. And they were getting divorced, and they were sending their women out. And these women had no way of making money. And Moses wasn't giving you permission or commanding you to do this. What he was doing was doing what you were supposed to be doing. Your hearts were so hardened, he needed to take care of your wives. You weren't doing it properly, and so he said, you have to give this certificate so we can take care of your women. This is a women's suffrage movement for Jesus. He said the reason that he did this is because these women, you know, men, what you were doing. You were sending them out. You didn't care about them. You were caring for their well-being. And so Moses was doing your job because your hearts were hard. Your hearts were hard. So Moses was doing what you're supposed to be doing. He's telling you you have to give this piece of paper. But I tell you this, it was not this way from the beginning. In other words, divorce was a concession. It was because the breakdown of marriage, because men wouldn't take care of their wives, what God had given them. So the Pharisees are like putting their pens down right now. They're like looking at each other. Okay, what do we do now? And Jesus goes on in verse 9. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery. In other words, you may think you unborn, but God does. This is crazy. Innocent or not innocent, are you remarried? Jesus says adultery. A piece of paper doesn't unone that which God has brought together. And this is heavy. And this is uncomfortable. And right now, I stand here and I go, we got to take a little bit of a step back. Because maybe some of you people who are divorced right now and you're remarried are going, that one hurts. And Jesus is picking on me, and I feel condemned, and I feel bad. And why is this crazy pastor talking about this? I don't know. It sounds like a good idea in August. As I stand here, I think, wow. We need to step back from Jesus' teaching on this particular piece. Because remember this. Jesus also is in the situation where a woman is actually caught in adultery, right? And she's caught in this adultery. The Pharisees bring her there and they say, who's going to stone her, type of a deal. And Jesus basically says, get out of here. You can throw the first stone if you were without sin. And the woman, she's huddled there, and Jesus says, look around. Who condemns you? No one. And then he says, and I don't condemn you either. Go and sin no more. Jesus says, you did something wrong. But I don't condemn you. Don't do it anymore. Here's the reality of what it says. I intended you to be married forever. I intended you to be married forever. So what do we do with this whole adultery thing? Are you in a perpetual state of adultery if you got divorced and remarried? No, I don't believe so. I don't think that's what he's teaching. Is it not what God intended from the very beginning? Absolutely. Was the act of the second marriage an adulterous act? Yeah, it was. That's what he says. Don't throw anything at me. That's what it says. But it also says that if you look at a person with a lustful thought in your heart, you committed adultery too. So I stand here and I look at you guys, and I look at myself, and we've got 99.9% of us that are adulterers, right? And so understand that, embrace that. I don't think Jesus is picking on you. He's just telling you the reality of the kingdom. The reality of the kingdom. You can't totally unone this thing. It was not that way from the beginning. God didn't intend for you to get a divorce. And there may be a lot of reasons why. So what do we do with this as we kind of continue on here? I'm going to give you 3 things. Jesus says this, you've committed adultery. I'm going to tell you this. Embrace it. Just embrace it. Yep. You do. And I recognize it. And maybe you didn't know, and maybe nobody's told you, but think of Jesus coming around you, throwing his arms around you, and going, aren't you glad I'm here to tell you this? This is the reality of the kingdom. I'm not condemning you. I'm just telling you the reality. I'm telling you what is true. And guess what? There's going to be, you can't totally unone this first marriage thing, and there's going to be some baggage to it. Embrace it. Embrace that this is the reality. That I didn't intend for you to live like this. God didn't intend from the very beginning for you to be able to unone what God has built together. So what do you do with that? Well, you pray and ask for God's grace. You say, God, you know what? This isn't a term in the Bible. I mean, this up. I read this somewhere. Let's say it enough because it sounds better. You pray for second marriage. You say, pray for it. You know what, God, give me grace in this moment. You know what, there are some things that I can't unone from that first marriage. And, in preparation for this, I thought, I need to talk to somebody because that has gone through this. And is what I'm saying actually true? At this church, we have 2 of our elders. They've gone through divorce, and they've been remarried. And I talked to them, and I talked to some other people, and they said, yeah, there are some things. And we're not talking just kids. There's just some baggage from that, because it totally doesn't unwind all the way. And they told me stories, and I won't share those stories today, but they just told me some of the stuff, that it wasn't supposed to be this way. And they've both been blessed with a spouse that is awesome, and they love the second marriage. And so, first off, embrace it. Second, confess, yep, God, I did this. Just lay it at his feet. Can God take something that is messed up, broken, not the way it's supposed to be, and make it good? Absolutely. You ever hear the story of David and Bathsheba? Most famous adulterous relationship in the scriptures, right? And they have a son by the name of Solomon, the smartest dude ever to live, right? Did God take something that was broken and make something really awesome come out of it? Absolutely. And you ask for that. God, you know what? I believe what your word says. I believe it wasn't supposed to be this way. And I'm going to embrace that. And I'm going to say, yep, at this moment I did this. But I'm going to move on in your grace, in this new marriage. Or maybe you're not married. And what do you do with that? And you're like, crud. You know, I should have got married before this teaching. You know, this is what I would tell you if I was sitting across from you at a table with a cup of coffee in my hand. You pray for sustaining grace. And this is, let me explain this. If you entered into this relationship of marriage, and then you're entering out of that relationship through divorce, that's painful. And there are things that you need to do that you need to just kind of walk through. And there's some things that you need to be able to lean on God. Don't run into the relationship of someone else right away. You know, take a couple of years. Catch your breath. Learn to lean on God. And when you don't need or want it so much, that relationship with that other person, and you're learning to go, you know, I'm okay with being single. I want this. I like a relationship. You know what? I think you'll be better prepared for that second marriage. Third marriage, whatever it is. And I would say, you know what? Pray for that sustaining grace. Here's the point of this whole sermon. And I'm sure I'll get some emails and, okay, talk to Jesus about it. It's not my fault. You can't totally break that which God has brought together. And so marriage is a serious, serious commitment and oath that we take. And God wants, from the very beginning, for you to be in a relationship that is like that is so committed and so tied together, that he brought you together with that other person. That's the point. You can't unone that which God has brought. Let's pray. Father God, we come before you. We ask for grace in this area. We ask that you would be the Lord of our marriages, whether it's our first, second, third, whatever. God, we recognize from the very beginning that you created man and woman to be together in this committed relationship forever. And we recognize that this teaching is difficult and hard, and that the disciples even said, well, maybe it's better that none of us would marry. And God, we just pray right now that for those of us who are married, or are maybe getting married, or are struggling in our marriage, that you would be the Lord of our marriages, that you would be the Lord of the preparation for that marriage. God, that you would be the Lord of that second marriage, and that you would continue to give grace in that moment. God, we thank you for the cross. We thank you for that we all recognize at some point that we were in need of grace. And God, in this situation, in this teaching,